Romeo Espino's life invites a difficult examination not of one man alone, but of institutions that reward obedience over reflection. In the military, discipline is survival. Orders must be followed. Hesitation can be fatal, and unity is essential. Espino embodied this doctrine completely. To him, command was not personal, it was procedural, and that belief allowed him to function effectively within a system that demanded unquestioning loyalty. But history asks what the moment could not. Where does duty end and responsibility begin? Espino's era reminds us that professionalism, when detached from accountability, can become dangerous. When soldiers are trained only to execute, not to question, the line between security and repression disappears. Stability is achieved, but at the cost of trust. His story forces future leaders to confront a hard truth. Authority is not validated by efficiency alone. It must be restrained by conscience, transparency, and law. Without these, even the most disciplined force can lose its moral compass. Today, Romeo Espino exists not as a hero or a villain, but as a case study in power. He represents a generation of officers who believed that the nation could be held together through control, and that fear was an acceptable price for order. For some, that belief prevented collapse. For others, it delayed justice and deepened wounds. The Philippines continues to wrestle with the consequences of that era. Questions of military involvement in civilian life, the balance between security and freedom, and the role of armed forces in a democracy. Espino's legacy survives in those debates. Because history does not end when a general retires. It continues in the institutions he shaped, the precedents he set, and the lessons a nation chooses to remember or ignore. Romeo Espino commanded an army, but history commands his memory. And in that judgment, his life stands as a reminder that power, once normalized, is never easily undone. History often remembers presidents, revolutionaries, and martyrs, but behind every era of power stands someone who enforces it. In the Philippines during the turbulent years of the 1970s, that figure wore a uniform, spoke little, and commanded everything. His name was Romeo Espino. To understand Romeo Espino is to understand a particular kind of soldier, one shaped not by applause or ideology, but by hierarchy, obedience, and control. He did not rise through fiery speeches or popular movements. He rose quietly, steadily, and methodically through the ranks of a military that would soon become the backbone of a nation under extraordinary rule. Born in 1914, Romeo Espino came of age in the Philippines, still learning how to be a nation. The scars of colonialism were fresh, and the promise of independence was fragile. For young men like Espino, the military offered structure, purpose, and a clear chain of command in a country still searching for stability. He entered the profession of arms at a time when discipline was not merely taught, it was demanded. Espino's early career followed the traditional path of a professional officer. He was not known as flamboyant or charismatic. Instead, his reputation rested on competence, reliability, and strict adherence to command. In a military culture where obedience was currency, these traits mattered more than popularity. Superiors trusted him. Subordinates feared disappointing him. World War II and its aftermath reshaped the Philippine military, transforming it from a colonial auxiliary into a national force tasked with internal security. The enemy was no longer foreign armies alone, but insurgencies, rebellions, and unrest from within. Espino adapted to this reality with the mindset of a disciplinarian. For him, instability was not a political question, it was a security problem. As communist insurgency grew in the countryside and social unrest simmered in the cities, the armed forces became increasingly involved in civilian life. Espino's career advanced alongside this expansion of military influence. Each promotion brought him closer to the center of national power, and each assignment reinforced his belief that order must come before debate. By the late 1960s, the Philippines was entering a period of deep division. Student protests, labor strikes, rural rebellion, and political violence pushed the government toward extraordinary measures. The military was no longer a background institution. It was becoming the state's primary instrument of control. In 1972, President Ferdinand Marcos declared martial law. With a single proclamation, civil liberties were suspended, political opposition silenced, and power consolidated. At the heart of this transformation stood the armed forces of the Philippines, and at the top of that institution stood General Romeo Espino, appointed as Chief of Staff. Espino would hold that position from 1972 to 1981, making him the longest-serving AFP chief in Philippine history. This was not an accident. Marcos needed a military leader who was loyal, predictable, and firm. Espino fit that requirement perfectly. As Chief of Staff, Espino commanded immense power. The military enforced curfews, arrested political opponents, controlled media access, and carried out counterinsurgency operations across the country. In this system, Espino was not merely an executor of orders, he was a gatekeeper of force. Yet Espino rarely spoke publicly. He did not cultivate a public image. He did not explain himself to civilians. His authority came from silence and structure. In a time of fear and uncertainty, his presence signaled that the military would not hesitate. Supporters viewed Espino as a stabilizing force. They credited him with maintaining order during years of chaos, preventing the country from descending into civil war, and strengthening the armed forces into a disciplined institution. Under his leadership, the AFP expanded, modernized, and entrenched itself deeply into governance. Critics saw something else entirely. They saw a military chief who enabled repression, who oversaw abuses, and who allowed the normalization of fear as a tool of governance. Arbitrary arrests, enforced disappearances, and the suppression of dissent occurred under the system Espino commanded. Whether by direct order or institutional tolerance, the military became synonymous with coercion. Espino himself remained distant from these accusations. He rarely addressed them. To him, the mission was clear: maintain control, defeat insurgency, and protect the state. Questions of morality were secondary to survival. In his worldview, hesitation was weakness, and weakness was dangerous. What makes Romeo Espino a compelling figure is not that he was unusually cruel or unusually kind, but that he represented the extreme logic of military professionalism under authoritarian rule. He believed deeply in hierarchy. He trusted systems more than people, and he viewed disorder as the ultimate enemy. As the years passed, martial law evolved from emergency measure into normalized governance. Espino remained at his post, steady and unchallenged. Younger officers rotated through assignments, but Espino stayed. His longevity symbolized continuity and stagnation. By the early 1980s, cracks began to form. Economic decline, international pressure, and growing opposition weakened the regime. Espino retired in 1981, leaving behind a military deeply embedded in politics. Unaccustomed to power, he did not attempt to reinvent himself as a public figure. He did not write memoirs filled with justifications or regrets. He faded from public life, much as he had operated within it quietly. Romeo Espino died in 2000, long after the fall of the regime he had served. By then, history had turned more critical. Martial law was no longer framed as necessary discipline, but as a period of widespread abuse. In that reassessment, Espino's legacy became inseparable from the system he upheld. Yet history is rarely simple. Espino was not the architect of martial law, but he was its enforcer. He did not design policy, but he ensured compliance. He was neither a tyrant nor a bystander. He was something more unsettling: a professional who executed power without questioning its purpose. His story forces uncomfortable questions. What happens when discipline replaces accountability? What happens when loyalty outweighs conscience? And what responsibility does a soldier bear when the state itself becomes oppressive? Romeo Espino does not offer easy answers. His life stands as a reminder that authority does not always arrive with speeches or slogans. Sometimes it arrives in silence, in orders followed without pause, and in institutions that value control above all else. In the end, Romeo Espino was not remembered for charisma or ideology, but for command. He held the army together during a time of fear, and in doing so, helped shape one of the most controversial chapters in Philippine history. His legacy remains a warning and a lesson. That power enforced without question can stabilize a nation, but it can also scar it for generations. When Romeo Espino stepped away from command, the uniform no longer carried authority, but its shadow remained. The military he left behind was stronger, larger, and deeply accustomed to power. Officers who had risen under his watch now occupied key positions, carrying forward a culture shaped by discipline, obedience, and silence. Even without Espino at the helm, his influence lingered in command rooms and field operations. As the nation slowly moved away from authoritarian rule, questions grew louder. Accountability, once suppressed, returned to public conversation. And in that reckoning, Espino's name surfaced not in speeches, but in footnotes attached to decisions that had shaped lives far beyond the barracks. Yet Espino himself offered no defense, no public reckoning. He lived his final years outside the spotlight, a former general in a country relearning democracy. History would debate his role, but he would not. Romeo Espino's story ends not with triumph or downfall, but with silence. And perhaps that is fitting, because his legacy was never about words, it was about power exercised, orders obeyed, and a nation forever changed by what happens when the military becomes the state.